You ever get that sinking feeling? You know, the one that you feel you've only heard maybe half the story? Or even a different story altogether? Hello and welcome to the Red Pill Diary. I'm Lewis, and I'll be your host. So, ready or not, let's flip the switch and shed some light on it. So what's this Red Pill Diary all about? Let's start with what it isn't. I'm not a historian, but I am a man of facts, and I am a lawyer. I'm not into conspiracy theories, and in this Red Pill Diary, it's not a call down or blame somebody podcast. This is a podcast, it's a journey, my journey, into what I believe are parallels of historical events, then and now in America and the world. People and events that I think shed light and understanding into the areas that coincide with what we see in our society today. It will, I hope, bring perspective to things happening now. It did for me. We hear much about this and that. You know, it's time for the backstory. It's time for some actual history, the full story. You know, the stories that help us understand what we see and hear, how to put things in perspective. This journey, began because someone said the Constitution is outdated and irrelevant for today's society. I asked myself, how did we even get here? That was the catalyst. So I found a rabbit trail, and I'm following it. I'm looking for familiar players and a backstory, and I've found them. Along the way, I've had more surprises than I have ever expected. My eyes are open, wide open now. So let's turn the lights on in the first act, and let's set the scene. So what does Natchez, Mississippi, and Nashville, Tennessee have in common? The Natchez Trace. Native Americans have used this trace for centuries. It's a 440-mile trail between Natchez, Mississippi, and Nashville, Tennessee. It's surrounded by bogs, cottonwood, dogwood, azaleas, oaks, cypress bogs. It goes to top of mountains, to the valleys. It traverses this oldest transportation route probably in North America. By 1785, most early Europeans and American explorers, migrants, traders used this to get back and forth between Nashville and Natchez to trade to the Mississippi and New Orleans. Most of the time, during this period of time, the trail was filled with people going back and forth. And so the early Americans founded inns, or what they call stands, on this trace in order to provide lodging and food for the travelers. At the end of this trace, on the northern top of it, about 70 miles southwest of Nashville, stands a monument. And that monument was erected in 1848 for truly an American hero. But that was 38 years after his death and wasn't set by the United States government. It was set by the state of Tennessee. So what's the importance of this trace? And what is this person who is buried under this monument left in an unmarked grave for 38 years? Now that's the interesting part. But we got to go back to the beginning, at least into this part, in order to describe this person, so that way we'll see why he was considered truly an American hero during this period of time. He was born in Charlottesville, Virginia in 1774. By his 20th birthday in 1794, he joined the militia from Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey to fight at the Whiskey Rebellion under Harry Lee. Harry Lee, Light Horse Harry Lee, the general who commanded this militia, 13,000. 13,000 is almost as large or larger than the actual force that fought the British during the Revolutionary War. And they went to Western Pennsylvania to put down a insurrection or rebellion of people in Western Pennsylvania who were objecting to the tax on whiskey that was started by or recommended by Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of Treasury for George Washington. This young man served there. 1 year later, he served under Mad Dog Anthony Wayne at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Battle of Fallen Timbers was a war or battle between the American government and the Native American tribes in that area around Ohio and Indiana and Kentucky. Following that battle, he served as a sharpshooter under the command of his longtime friend. And that person then was also asked to serve as the secretary of the President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. And he spent 2 years living at the White House with Thomas Jefferson. Following that, Thomas Jefferson asked Congress, and he appointed him as the lead for an expedition to the mouth of the Columbia River. That person was none other than Meriwether Lewis. Meriwether Lewis, who traveled thousands of miles through uncharted territory at the time, took copious notes and diaries between him and Clark and all the other subordinates with him during the time of this travel, a journey no one thought he would return from. But they did. And all the wealth of information he brought back eventually would find itself into now recently produced about 50 years ago, 11 volumes, I believe, and one full volume of graphs, maps, and documents that they sent, drawings that they had made during this trip. The abridged version is very, it's a journal. It's a journal of his journeys and their journeys, but it's interesting and it's edited in a way that tells a story from the time of St. Louis to the time that he returns back to St. Louis. Following this expedition, the reward to Meriwether Lewis was a governorship in the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase. Remember, Jefferson had purchased and asked the Congress to ratify his purchase of the Louisiana territory from Napoleon Bonaparte. He was now the governor of that, following the governorship of James Wilkinson, the general, who we will cover in a couple of episodes in the future. So stay tuned to that. Just remember that name, Anthony Wayne, and remember him as well as Wilkinson. During this period of time, Lewis found himself really at odds with the political stuff going on between the people around there and the government and its inability to basically pay its own bills. And so he decided that he was going to take a trip to get to see Madison to deal with some of the unpaid bills that he had as personal expenses as a governor. And so he left his post and headed towards Washington, D.C. That took him to this trace. He went through this trace and he ended up 72 miles southwest of Nashville, where he allegedly committed suicide. Now, the question then becomes, why? Why would you travel all the way from St. Louis, Missouri to almost Nashville, Tennessee, and then commit suicide? Why wouldn't you just stop somewhere along the line? Why would you have to go all the way there? Some of these questions that kind of popped up for me during this read and this research and the reason why this is important, because I started here because this it took me to other places, both forward and backwards. Starting here because it's a place to kind of set the post in the ground and work around it. What struck me in this was no one's ever determined whether it was suicide or murder. He was murdered or he went insane because he had malaria. There's the three primary theories. He committed suicide, like it was reported. We'll get to that in just a minute. He was murdered. We'll get to that in a minute. Or he committed suicide because he was delirious because he had a severe bout of malaria at the time. Recognize that during this period of time, there's an issue with Aaron Burr. Alexander Hamilton was killed in a duel. The Louisiana Purchase occurred. And a lot of things are going around and revolving around this one person. And it wasn't Meriwether Lewis. It was James Wilkinson. James Wilkinson came up because of my first stop here with Meriwether Lewis. Here's a man who has journaled his way across the vast majority of the West as we know it. No one in the party ever mentioned that he had a problem with melancholy. No one in any history prior to that, except one time where someone claimed that he got into a drunken brawl and he asked for a court-martial and was exonerated. That's the only time that I can find that's ever been mentioned that he had an issue with alcohol. And to be honest with you, the things that I've read, and those of you who are historians would know, being stuck out in the middle of some post in, let's say, Astoria, Oregon, there's not much to do. And drinking, unfortunately, was a problem. Read Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs, and you can see there's an issue, and it always was an issue in these posts of drinking. Not saying that's good, bad, or indifferent, just saying that's just one instance. That was the time he was reassigned to be a sharpshooter. Now, this person is a sharpshooter, and he crosses the West as we know it with his rifle and basically keeps from being killed by grizzlies and other wild animals and other people that were not necessarily his friend or friendly to him because of his good shot. Here's why that's important. Because according to the eyewitness, the only eyewitness to this was the lady who maintained the end, said that she shot himself twice, but she didn't see it. She just heard two shots. No one saw, apparently, what happened, but that was the report. Let's go through some of these questions that I had when I went through here. And we'll get to the reason why this is important in just a few minutes. If he is crazy, insane, or had a problem with melancholy or depression, or had a habit, as Jefferson wrote to an individual following his death, shortly thereafter. If that was true, the question becomes why did Jefferson advance him to his personal secretary and reside with him for 2 years in his house if that was an issue? If you thought he had a problem with depression, then why would you appoint him to a dangerous mission that would require him to be alone and cross this dangerous terrain with few men whom they may not come back? Then why is it that you would then, when he comes back, if he had a habit, and that habit would be, say, drinking, then why would you appoint him to be the governor of Louisiana? There's no issues ever raised about it, except this one person, Captain Russell at Fort Pickering, who happens to be a friend of James Wilkerson. He sends a letter and to Jefferson and others and says that Lewis is acting odd or he's insane. Then why did Captain Russell advance him $100? Why would you give a person who's insane $100? Then this other person who happens to be there, who is appointed by or recommended by James Wilkerson, his name is James Neely. He was the agent for the Chickasaw Nation. All of a sudden, James Neely shows up and says, "Oh, I want to help you or escort you across this Natchez Trace." Not the actual military escort from Fort Pickering. No, this agent was going to escort him to Nashville, Tennessee from Fort Pickering. And why? Because he said that this is a dangerous place with brigands and bandits, and because you're such an important person and a hero of the American people, I want to make sure you're safe. So then why did James Neely, allegedly in his own report, leave him by himself to go up the trail for 2 or 3 hours alone while he went and looked for 2 horses? But then never says anything about that later on. He is the one who said he interviewed Miss Griner, or Grinder, depending on the report you read, who was at the inn without her husband. That's her report, what happened. And you'd have to read the report in this 1893 book that was edited by Dr. Elliot Coues, Coues, in 1893. And he wrote, it's a 4-volume book. And in the first volume, in the preface and the editor's discussion section, I think it's on page 53, I believe. 43. You start reading some of this information, and he goes through these things point by point. Now, he doesn't say, and no one has ever said one way or the other. I find it interesting that no one ever went to any length to find out. Here's Thomas Jefferson. I would assume that after this amount of time, that could be assuming wrong, that the President of the United States or the former President of the United States had a friendship with this younger man at the time. He killing himself would be something that you would think raise some flags for you to go say, well, let's at least go find out, and some interview people. The government never interviewed him. The only person ever interviewed was James Neely, and then a person named Alexander Wilson came by 2 years later to interview her and took her story. And her story was, according to Dr. Coues, highly inconsistent and unbelievable. The facts just didn't make sense. Now, people over the years have come out on different positions, but the primary position is that the historians take is that he committed suicide. Why is that? Because the 2 people who knew him best, Jefferson and William Clark, weren't surprised. That was it. Not because they did an investigation, not because there was an autopsy, not because there was any trial, just because 2 people said so. Here's a man who we read about or have read about, and I had read quite a bit about because I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Apparently committed suicide by shooting himself twice. This is a sharpshooter who crossed the wilderness and shot animals, but couldn't shoot himself. And prior to leaving Fort Pickering, he wrote 2 letters that were rational. The whole thing makes you say, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't really pass the smell test. It'd be something that you think that people would want to find out. All of this, how does this fit into the Red Pill Diary? These are the things they don't tell you. I never knew this. I was never told this. Not that maybe they did and I wasn't listening. Why didn't the government question it? Why did they just assume that he was depressed? Part of this is going to ferret out about one person whose name is James Wilkinson, because Meriwether Lewis is not going to be the only person that's associated with James Wilkinson, who died interestingly. Let's just put it that way. Recognize that there are other people behind the scenes that I haven't discussed yet because I'm saving those because this is all going to come together to weave together. So what we have here is a person who is an American hero on his way to Washington, D.C. to talk to Madison about something very important, and he's very secretive about it. People start to show up associated with another individual, and all of a sudden, this person commits suicide. No investigation has taken place. Only interview was with one person, was done twice. There was question in the community that they believed that it was the husband of this lady innkeeper that killed Meriwether Lewis, but no one could prove it. All the historians, most of them, lean towards the suicide, and that's the historical document. That's what if you go to the national parks, that would be their say. That's what they would say. But if you read it, I would encourage you to read about that, because what strikes me, and should you, is that people say one thing, but they don't follow through. They don't do the things you would expect to be done for the level of accomplishment this person would have. And this is not the first time. Think forward. Think today. Are there times that you know that people have disappeared or something unpleasant has happened to somebody and there's no investigation, and they just say, well, he drowned. He drowned in 3 feet of water because he was intoxicated. He or she disappeared. They don't know where they're at. Or there's nothing to this. They're not going to look. They're not going to do an investigation. That's why we need to know history and the backstory, because in all these other instances, there's a backstory. But this backstory didn't come out until about 38 or 40 years later. And really, it didn't see the light of day until, in the 1870s, 1880s, after the Civil War. Now, I'm making some broad generalizations here. I know I am. And historians will say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Okay, good. But my point here is not that. My point here is not to make a conclusion about what happened. My point here is this doesn't sound right. And it should elicit in you hey, wait a minute. Why am I listening to what was told? So I read it early and it said, oh, he committed suicide. That's what's got me started. It was like, wait a minute here. And I asked myself those questions. And so I went to start to look. And guess what? It's not as concrete as they would make it sound. They, being the government or any historian, said, oh, that's what happened. No one really knows. That's their opinion. So it's good for us, you and me, to read it ourselves and come to a conclusion. The conclusion I would have is no one knows, but it doesn't sound on the up and up. Now, could be. It's possible. It is also plausible, and it is also probable based on the things that we know now. When someone says that's the way it is, and that's a legal term called ipse dixit, meaning because I say so, one needs to get the backstory. Now, next time we're going to talk about a few other chosen individuals, and the associated person along with that person would be James Wilkinson. Until next time. Well, we filled those pages. If you have comments, suggestions, share them. The more input, the more likely a better outcome. I'm moving forward because backwards is not an option. I've turned the lights on here, and I'll be leaving them that way. Join me next time on The Red Pill Diary.